welcome everyone to Andrew Tate and the Lost Boys. So that's the session, and this is part of the State of the Nation strand. I'm not going to read out the blurb, but there's two parts to the discussion. One part of the discussion is what does Andrew Tate himself represent? And then the second part of the discussion is Are Boys Lost? And obviously we're trying to bring together those two questions. My name is Toby Marshall, and I'm an A-level teacher of film, and you can find out more about me at my Substack, which is called Toby's Jug. I became interested in the Tate phenomenon after a number of motions were proposed at a student debate club that I ran, three of which related to Andrew Tate. The young men and women that I teach are certainly not lost by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, they're very focused individuals, and they're actually excelling in their education. But I was interested in why Andrew Tate had become such a pole of focus and discussion amongst these young people. So I was very honored when Claire Fox asked me to chair this session, because I think it's something we need to get to the bottom of. So this afternoon we have four great panelists who will bring some light to this issue, trying to understand what Andrew Tate represents, or King Cobra to you, what he represents to young people, and the more important issue, but related issue, of whether we believe young men are lost in our society, and also what it is that we might do about it. So the format of the discussion today is I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. They're going to speak for 6 minutes as an absolute maximum. I'd like to remind our panel that they are not the most relevant person in the room, which is one of Andrew Tate's catchphrases. He likes to describe himself as the most relevant. The most relevant people in the room are you. So I will be keeping them to exactly 6 minutes in their introduction. So speaking in this order, and speaking first on the far left is Nick Dixon.
Far left.
Yay!
Who'd have thought?
An intentional joke.
And we thought Andrew Tate was big. He's a comedian, GB News presenter, and host of The Current Thing. Second, on my far right, we have Ashley Frawley, who's a senior lecturer in sociology at Swansea University and author of The Semiotics of Happiness. Then we have, on my immediate right, Matilda Gosling, who's a researcher and author of the soon-to-be-published Evidence-Based Parenting and Teenagers. And then fourth, on my immediate left, we have Dennis Kavanagh, director of the Gay Men's Networks. And I do kind of have a view to kind of 3 questions that we might address. What does he represent? Are young men lost? And what way forward for us? So Nick, would you like to open us up?
Yeah, absolutely. Can everyone hear me all right first? Because this is going to be absolute gold. So we want to... What a start. Why would I do that to myself? All right, only got 6 minutes, so let's go. So Andrew Tate is like Brexit. I thought I'd start with a ridiculous assertion and try and back it up for a bit of fun. So I've been following Tate for years, watching his stuff, and he now follows me on Twitter, but who cares? So we have a few DMs, whatever. We're kind of bros. Anyway... But that's nothing to do with it, because I've been following him for years before that, watching his stuff. But when he kind of blew up and became the most Google man on the planet, etc., I started to do a kind of informal survey of men that I would meet. So like a taxi driver after work, I asked him, what do you think of Andrew Tate then? He's like, I love Tate. And he was a Muslim, but he said he loved him before he even converted, so it wasn't to do with that. And then I asked another taxi driver, also happened to be a Muslim. He loved Tate. And I'm like, okay, Muslim taxi drivers love Tate. That's a scientific fact. And then I was like, So let me ask some other people. So I asked my barber, who's a Christian, not a taxi driver, and he loved Tate. I was like, okay, is it like a blue-collar thing? Then I asked my accountant, and he loved Tate. So what I realized was the media hates Tate, but the men aren't really buying it, okay? And then I watched a BBC documentary, inevitably a hit piece against Tate, but even in that, they conceded that among 16 to 17-year-olds, to address the lost boys part, 52% had a positive view of Tate. I'm like, where have I heard that figure before, right? Yeah. So I was like, oh, Tate's the new Brexit, right? And it's actually even more emphatic because only 19% had a negative impression of him. So I'm like, okay, so men and boys have kind of spoken. And it's a bit like Brexit in that the establishment might not like Tate, but the people have spoken. And also, there are positives. So with Tate, there are positives like self-discipline that he advocates, stoicism, hard work, depression's not a chemical imbalance, which seem to be now backed up by science. And then there's also, as with Brexit, a kind of fuck you element, frankly, to the entire culture that is kind of demeaned, demoralized, degraded, and discriminated against men. So a lot of men have basically just had enough. And it doesn't matter about the media opposition or what any of us actually say, because people have decided, we basically like Tate because he's finally offering a positive voice for masculinity. So the left, of course, hate Tate because they see him as an ideological opponent. The mainstream media hate Tate, but if anyone in this room cares about the mainstream media, they're probably at the wrong event, frankly. But the most stick I've had for liking Tate is from conservatives who hate him because he's not a moral paragon, they don't believe. So, but the point is, it doesn't actually matter about your pearl-clutching hit piece in The Guardian or The Spectator, because, as I say, people have decided. Men, the best thought I've had on this from other people, the most positive is from sort of tradcons or conservatives who've said to me that men and women need to come together and stop all this division and red pill stuff. And I understand that, but the problem is, to give you another analogy, men are kind of like Germany after World War I. Bear with me. They basically... They feel betrayed, they've had enough, they're not coming to the negotiation table. I'm not saying Tate's Hitler, by the way. Can we clarify that? Although, I mean, they're both good speakers and probably both wear Hugo Boss. But the point is, I'm so sorry. The point is, it's only going to get worse. The point is, men are not really ready to negotiate. They've kind of had enough. And Jordan Peterson came along, and he was actually very moderate, but he still wasn't moderate enough for the mainstream. Kathy Newman was attacking him and all that sort of stuff. So what you're saying is, so then Tate comes along, and then people think, oh, Tate's a bit extreme. But trust me, the next thing is only going to be more extreme. I was talking to Will Noland on my podcast, and he was sacked from Eton for his lecture on masculinity. Now, I'm not saying Will's extreme, but he said to me, Andrew Tate is a feminist, which might be the first time you've heard that. He explained to me, he said, that Tate buys into the paradigm of promiscuity, which was promoted by the feminists to destabilize the traditional family. So those are the kind of ideas coming at you next. Tate is a feminist. So the point is, unless we listen to men and respect men, it's only going to get more extreme. And the answer is not going to come, sadly, from Caitlin Moran. Okay? It's not going to come from women telling men how to be, because we've had enough of that. Men are now treated as defective women, and they've had enough. So it's time to actually listen to men. But the problem is that any positive conception of masculinity now falls outside of the Overton window to the point where it can't even be discussed in the mainstream, except with these very lame takes from people like Caitlin Moran, who apparently has never met a man with functioning testosterone. So that is pretty much my pitch. I guess I'm saying men need to take back control, guys. All right, Tate's like Brexit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That's a great start, mate. Well done.
Okay, Ashley.
Oh boy, never before have I wanted to sit in an audience rather than on a panel. Right, okay, so Andrew Tate is, I agree, is a reaction to a tendency to scapegoat men. Like, can you imagine living as a man? I have 2 daughters, and I would love to have more kids, and my mother-in-law asked me, do you want to have more kids because you want to have a boy? And I was like, no, I do not want to have a boy today. It seems like it's such a difficult time to be a boy. It's not, it seems like there's very little attached to being a man that is a higher kind of status. And I'm not saying that, men have to have a high status, but I think in every culture, you have rites of passage for women and men, for boys and girls, where you move from one status to the next. And that from one sort of way of being into another, and the next one has a higher status. But our culture is missing that. We've had this sort of flattening out of these of status. So the idea that if you go to university, that brings you to a higher status, we're like, I don't know about that. Or the idea that when you get married, that's a higher status. No, I mean, marriage is just take it or leave it. You know, how does that really change your relationship? Or just going from a boy to a man, is that a higher status? No, we live in a culture that valorizes youth. In fact, it can be experienced as a lower status. Same with going from a girl to a woman. That can be experienced as a lower status. You know, we know the adult generation destroyed the world and so on. So I think our culture is missing through this sort of flattening out of status, we are missing these rites of passage that all cultures have. And I think some of this sort of reaction, some of what Andrew Tate represents is this reaction to this loss of status, this sense that, well, what does it mean to grow up and be a man? I don't know. Well, here's somebody who's telling me. And, it can lead to this sense of being set adrift, kind of lost at sea, and you look for rules about how to be a man, and somebody will give you those rules. And it's the same thing for women, by the way. Like, I grew up in a therapy culture as well, where I would ask my dad, what should I be? What should I do? And my dad was like, whatever makes you happy. I was like, I don't know what that means. Tell me, give me something, even for me to rebel against, But it was nothing. And so I was looking around. I was like, well, how do I grow up? Give me some certainties. And where would I find it? I found it in self-help books, right? And I think that's, I think Andrew Tate in a lot of ways, I listened to a lot of these podcasts and I was thinking to myself, this is therapy culture, but masculinized. Because therapy culture, the self-help genre is very feminized. And this is a masculinized version. The problem is that it can't just like the feminized version of therapy culture, it doesn't solve or fill the void that contributed to its rise. And that is a profound loss of meaning, a loss of a project that gives your life meaning. Because it's too focused on the self. Now, there's nothing wrong with self-improvement. There's nothing wrong with, wanting those kinds of rules, these kinds of certainties, and going to the gym and this sort of thing, wanting a little bit of certainty about how to relate to the opposite sex, maybe be a bit more adept in social situations. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. But the problem is that it doesn't fill the void of a loss of meaning beyond the self that can give your life purpose. It's too self-focused. It's too self-referential. And so ultimately, it can't solve this profound meaninglessness that young people have in society, where growing up is what's the point? What's so great about being an adult, right? What's so, in lots of cultures, when you become an adult, you, like in Greek, they say, anigo spitie, I open a house, I open a household. And now I'm a head of a household, and that makes me a man. Or I am a mother, and that gives me a higher status. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. So that's this sort of void feeds the rise of figures like Andrew Tate, but he can't solve that problem. You need a project beyond the self. And the second thing is a loss of, he speaks to a kind of loss of intergenerational relationships, where we are, part of this feeling of being set adrift is that we don't really relate to older members of our sex or our gender, or older members of our society generally in a positive way. Lots of cultures, again, have institutionalized relationships between men and boys, between women and girls, and informal relationships. Through which you have a kind of mentoring into growing up. Just to give an anecdote, my husband used to be a professional soccer player, and there were always older men that would kind of administer to the younger boys. And my husband does this, he's Greek, he's a villager. He does this as a matter of course. There's a lost boy that was living in our neighborhood, and he'd bring him over to do our housework. And I asked him, why do you do this? He's like, oh, well, he just seemed like he needed help. And he didn't think at all oh, this is my, I'm going to do. It was just a matter of course that that's what you do. Now, that's a bit weird. Oh, older man bringing a young boy around. It's kind of polluted. And we have increasingly institutionalized these kinds of relationships or formalized them in rules and so on, in vetting procedures. And so we've cut off that intergenerational transfer. And so in that space, in that void, you have people like Tate that can speak to younger men and give them a sense of direction. But that's not, that can never be a substitute for the kind of community that used to fill that and that created those intergenerational partnerships.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, Matilda.
Okay, thank you very much. Hard acts to follow. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas. So first of all, I think this is a new version of an old story, what's going on with the Lost Boys. Secondly, I'm going to disagree slightly with the provocation and also with some of the ideas that Nick has talked about the kind of rigidity of masculinity and the questions over that. And then I'm going to talk about the fact that this is a kind of perfect storm that's being created by the internet, porn, and modern complexity. First of all, thinking about the boys. Boys are, according to the research and kind of what we know, they're later developers than girls, so that can make it tricky for them in school. They're more cut off from social support, so female friendships tend to be marked by intimacy and self-disclosure, and boys' friendships tend to be marked by shared activities. They're also a lot less likely to relate to their parents in the house, even through fighting. So teenage girls, I have one, almost 2 of them, tend to have a kind of very locking horns relationship if they want to kind of relate to their parents but are otherwise not communicating, but at least they're keeping that relationship going, whereas boys have, according to what we know, more of a tendency to close themselves off, so they don't have this research going. They're also led more by a kind of burgeoning sexuality because testosterone is quite a happy fuel for that. So this is leaving boys in a slightly rudderless position, at least until they've understood their newfound sexuality and also kind of caught up with girls developmentally. And there have always been stories of lost boys and the corrupting influence of the kind of penny dreadfuls or of TV violence or computer games. I went to, and I can see Bev Jackson here, I went to the LGB Alliance conference on Friday and saw a speech in the afternoon, and one of the stories told in a completely different context was about Aristophanes and the fact that he had written a play which talked about the dreadful teenage boy habit of taking hot baths. So this is a story that is really, really old. It goes back at least 2,500 years. Then moving on to the kind of I think that rigid ideas about masculinity and femininity persist. So the provocation talks about the possibility that we've become really nervous about masculinity. And I think there's a really important difference here about roles versus being. So yes, roles have shifted dramatically over the last kind of 50 to 70 years or so. But actually, in terms of what it means to be a man, I'm not sure that that's shifted quite as much. So if we look at a kind of proxy measure, for example, of sexual assault. So if we kind of take the idea that the older ideas about masculinity, if they were so good, then we would expect sexual assault rates to be a lot kind of less prevalent in the past. They're not. So if you look at kind of data from the crime survey for England and Wales, 2004 to 5, 4.2% of women that year were experienced sexual assault. And then for the last 2 years of data we've got prior to the pandemic, it's pretty much the same. And then arguably that kind of traditional idea of masculinity, so either going back a lot of generations here or kind of looking across to more conservative societies, is exactly what Tate and his followers are advocating. So it's kind of male domination, female subservience. He is certainly not a feminist. And there's also, I think, a really pretty toxic, fixed idea about what it is to be a girl or a boy, and I think that might even have got worse in recent years. So I believe that that's one of the reasons that so many gender non-conforming young people who become distressed about their gender because they don't fit into these boxes that society expects them to fit into. And it would be really good not to make this worse. And then finally on this, I think there's a point about toxic masculinity, and this again was raised in a provocation. And for those of you who've read Richard Reeves' book of Boys and Men, he makes this point as well, that it's a bad idea to talk about toxic masculinity because it kind of basically makes boys feel bad about themselves. But there's a subtle difference between not painting toxic masculinity as an inevitability, but also we have to be able to name what's happening, and women and girls have to be able to name what they experience as male violence and abuse, and we have to be really careful when we're talking about this, that we don't kind of separate off the kind of ideas from not being able to discuss what's happening. And then my final point is about this kind of perfect storm idea. So there's the widespread nature of porn that everyone's familiar with means, I believe, that there's a real sense of entitlement to female bodies and then anger when it's denied among a subset of straight men and boys. So girls are seen very much as objects, boys are seen very much as the subjects, they're the people doing too. And there's also a vulnerability in desiring somebody who can say no to them, and that links back to this idea about masculinity. So the kind of traditional idea of masculinity is that boys do not want to be, boys and men should not be vulnerable, but this puts them into a vulnerable situation. They're kind of reacting against it. The internet allows us to feel as if we know an influencer intimately. This wasn't possible in the past. That relationship becomes deeper. It's also a perfect medium to create angels and devils and to kind of spread this influence. And then finally, Tate's got a very simple message. So work hard, dominate and control other people, especially women, and you'll have what Tate had, at least before he was arrested. So kind of cars and wealth and on-demand sex. And that's a very nice message for some people. And the world's so complex now, and there's so much information available. So having this kind of simple route map, I think, is very appealing to some boys and men. So in conclusion, we've got this kind of new old story. It's not as simple, I don't think, as a societal rejection of masculinity, and then this kind of perfect storm environment.
Thank you very much. Perfectly timed. Perfectly timed. Dennis.
Hello. Ooh, hi, can you hear me? Andrew Tate and I are both products of Luton Sixth Form College. So, as you can see, it churns out derivative provocateurs at a rate of knots. The most helpful thing I can do in this panel, much like Andrew Tate, is offer you a pretty gay perspective on what's going on. Because he is so gay, he really is. And I'll offer you a gay perspective on what's going on here, because I'll tell you what I see in this hypercharged heterosexual battle of the sexes, but which, by God, I'm bored of. I see that in the heterosexual world there is no space or capacity or permission to discuss what Camille Paglia or Christina Hoffman would call virile masculinity. There's only toxic masculinity. No one talks about virile masculinity. No one talks about moral masculinity. Now, let me do a thought experiment for you. If I got on my Twitter account right now, this is one of the few times in my life I'm not banned from Twitter, if I posted like 10 guys I really like, right? I'd have hundreds of people and hundreds of women say, oh, you go for it, that's great. It would be seen as fun, healthy, virile. If a straight guy did that, I think we can imagine what the comments might be. You're objectifying, you're creepy, you're this, that, the other. There's no concept of toxic masculinity in a gay club, right? The more toxic the bloke, the better, honey, right? We love a bad boy. We don't mind being objectified. And I'm joking. Please do it. I'm joking, but there is a serious point here, because Tate is, in fact, an artifact of the counter-enlightenment, which is what you are living through. Okay, the original Enlightenment is built on reason, and it's built on words. The counter-enlightenment you are living through is built on feelings and the therapeutic discourse that comes from it, and aesthetics. Let me explain. Trans women are women because I feel like a woman. Emphasis on feel. If you don't respect my pronouns, that will hurt me. Emphasis on hurt. That's therapeutic discourse. Who gives a damn about those? Just aren't your pronouns, right? You don't look like a sheet to me, mate. That's the first limb of the counter-enlightenment. The second limb of the counter-enlightenment is the aesthetic world gone crazy. Every kid has a smartphone. TikTok is the #1 youth medium. It is no accident Tate is a video communicator. It's an aesthetic world. A child aged 10 today will have seen many million times more the images than I saw when I was 10. How people look, what they look like, how they curate their online life, what they look like. It's singularly important. A tweet that has an image in it will get thousands more views than one that does not. So that's why the Enlightenment can't beat things like gender or critical race theory, because the Enlightenment talks reason, and words. And the counter-Enlightenment is up here talking aesthetics and therapy. That's why when Helen Joyce a little while ago said, all these institutions are failing, that's why. These institutions aren't built to meet that. Now, we add into that a few other toxic things that are going on. In the first place, we have rather disgracefully placed the burden of identity on vulnerable little children. We've given them the problem that they should never have had. I didn't have to spend hours as a 14-year-old in front of YouTube ruminating on masculinity, right? Went out on my BMX and caused trouble in Luton. I probably passed Andrew Tate at some point. I was probably more butch than him at the time too. But rumination tracks very well, almost perfectly, with depression. And what we are doing with children, either at the Andrew Tate end of the spectrum or the poor kids sucked in by Jeffrey Marsh and those ghouls, is we're imposing the burden of identity on them. We're saying, you sit down, you form a theory of yourself, you concretize that theory of yourself, and you tell us who you are. That's a wicked thing to do. And it creates, because it is a burden, in the context of a counter-enlightenment, it creates creative decline. People become living memes. This aesthetic revolution is built on pornography, which is now widely available. You know, what 14-year-old boy isn't going to look at porn, for goodness sake? But I agree with our previous speakers. I often talk about the pornography of violence and the violence of pornography. They're two sides of the same coin. When I was in criminal practice as a barrister, I emphasise, years ago, there's no such thing as the rough sex defence. Boys had never seen rough sex at anything like the rates that they do now. So they're aesthetically swamped. They're given the burden of identity, and surprise, surprise, they end up with this derivative provocateur who is recycling really some gangster rap tropes, which is really what he's borrowing from. He's adding in a bit of grifting. He's also adding in some really deliberate taunts of the other side. He's trolling in many respects. But he is providing a model of virile masculinity, which heterosexuals just don't speak about anything like the way that in a gay male chat group, right, it gets pretty spicy sometimes. There's no problem discussing virile masculinity, and there's no problem discussing moral masculinity, which is what you get from someone like Jordan Peterson at the other end of the spectrum of this general rumination about masculinity. But in both cases, the heterosexual world seems to have a real difficulty, it seems to me, in that being discussed without it immediately becoming toxic masculinity. Now, you see that in the discussion about suicide stats. It's pretty crazy that that's the leading cause of death for men, I think, under 25. That should be crazy. And there should be a space where we can say we can have a discussion about men, for men, and it be only men, without a panelist saying, well, I want to talk about women. Sure, do it, but do it, to quote Sex Matters, I believe in single-sex spaces. Trust me, I really do. But I also, like my bed, but I also believe in single-sex arguments. And to be serious for a moment, it is ridiculous that we can't have a discussion about that without it segueing into all sorts of difficulties. So that's my time. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you to the speakers.
Hi, I'm Steve Mox, and I write science review papers about the sexes and a book called The Woman Racket. Tate, I don't know much about him, but he seems to me emblematic of opposition to what is a comprehensive truth inversion that's been dumped on us by the elite about the sexes. And my field is, various, but biology. If you look from root biology upwards, you can see what the reality is, and everybody intuits this. The root problem in all biological systems, bear with me, 30 seconds. The root problem in all biological systems, accumulation of gene replication error. How do you deal with that? You get males to compete in terms of genomic integrity. Females sexually select the guys towards the top of the pyramid, ignore the rest. And you police that by a general opprobrium to all males. Hence, if you look at discrimination, it's basically if you're male and different, as in gays. Now, I think people intuitively understand all this. This view has been completely rejected, and Tate is one of the few people that's seriously rebelling against that, and people keen into him for that reason.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't say I had the privilege to live with, no, that's not the right way to form it, but when I grew up, many boy friends of mine grew up without fathers, and for them one of the biggest challenges in their life was how you have to take responsibility for your actions throughout your life, and finding support and just having the courage to stand up for what you believe in. It was a big challenge for them because they had no models, they had no certainty. And I think with this Tate issue, one of the biggest challenges that we have is how we view the idea of responsibility in our lives. This was the serious thing. The less serious thing would be my question: what would you, from your gay perspective, give to heterosexual men about the topic of responsibility? What advice would you have for us whenever it comes to our relationships, taking care of each other, or just finding some kind of leeway in the dating market, for example? Just to, yeah, whatever.
Well, there's some things I do agree with Andrew Tate, because he does expose the gynocentric nature of feminism. And there's some good points he does make, but my main issue with him is that he doesn't have that sort of core. Like, he talks about money, wealth, status, all that, which is good and fine, but for what purpose? Does it fulfill you? Why are you doing that? Like, the material essence of what it means to be a man, that part is missing, and it's more like he's focusing on the superficial elements, but he's not going deep enough to figure out, like, the core root. Because the core root what's going to give you a more fulfilling life as a man, and probably as well as a woman.
Okay, excellent. I'm just interested, from speaking to students about it, do people think we're taking Tate himself too seriously? Because when I've spoken to both male and female students about this, when I was asked to do this session, and one of the things they said is he was received initially, at least, as a kind of Ali G parodic version of masculinity. And students, and this was during lockdown, that he kind of spiked in terms of interest. And young men and young women who were trying to understand young men who were interested in Andrew Tate didn't take it that seriously. So I'm just interested if anyone, I think the second part of this session is really important, like, are boys lost? But are we taking Andrew Tate himself too seriously? Is this just a kind of slightly, as you maybe suggest, Dennis, a sort of postmodern parodic display, a performative thing? Should we really take it that seriously? Or maybe more importantly, did young men take it that seriously as a role model? Just wonder if anyone has any views on that. We've got two people who put their hands up at the back.
Thank you. My boy at 15, 16, he's now 21. We've had quite heated debates about Andrew Tate because he is a fan. And I remember a couple of years ago now, he actually said he wanted an 18-year-old virgin as a wife so he could imprint on her.
Yeah, that's a Tate phrase,
that
isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
Dangerous. You know, there may be things that are, funny, but that's terrifying.
Well, I do think that maybe it started as a joke. I saw a video the other day of Andrew Tate saying, how can you say that you're a man and when you're from Canada? That you can't...
A few people have asked that question.
It's true. So I think, for a big part, he's definitely trolling, if you're asking me. He's, pardon me, but he's taking the piss, right? But people have taken him seriously, and because he could make money out of that, I think he's sort of gone along with that. And it has had a big impact, because I'm going to talk about Twitter as well. I was having a conversation with a trans-identifying man, aka trans woman, and I was saying, why do you think you're a woman? Like, in what sense are you a woman? And he literally said it was because what Andrew Tate was saying, he was basically saying that someone like me cannot be a man. So it is having a big impact. It is really having a big impact. And I think that we just need a really good, and many more good role models for young men, like Peter, wait, what's the name? Sorry, that you said. The
Jordan
psychologist,
Peterson.
the Canadian psychologist.
Jordan Peterson.
Yes, I
Canadian
quite like
man.
him.
Okay, so I'm going to bring the panel back in.
Right, I'm happy to also be representing Canadians. Right, okay, so are we taking him too seriously? Yeah, I mean, I agree with that it starts as a joke, but it becomes serious. And that's how a lot of these, Angela Nagel wrote a book a few years ago called Kill All Normies, where she talked about how a lot of this stuff started out as a joke and as parody, and then gradually it's a way of saying the unsayable in a jokey kind of way, things that people would like to say, or reacting against the excesses of woke culture or whatever, and then gradually it starts to become a bit more serious. There was a question about, for what purpose are you doing this? Like, that's what I was trying to get at. There's no purpose to, this kind of self-orientation. And that's what I mean when I say it's a mirror of the kind of feminized therapy culture, because the anchor for meaning is no longer in something beyond the self, it's in the self. And that's a very shallow place to anchor the meaning, because you're always changing. You change your feelings about things all the time, and if your whole purpose in life is self-fulfillment, you're always going to be wanting something. Whereas if your purpose in life is beyond the self, then it's not that thing is going to make you happy, it's that it makes your suffering worthwhile along the way. And I think that's what's missing for a lot of people, is something beyond the self. And I could just want to add, there's like a TikTok video. The most unlikely viral thing is this guy I think he's a fisherman from Maine, who's a lobster fisherman. Has anybody seen this? Anyways, it's totally viral. And as I was watching these videos once, I just fell down this pit, and I'm watching all these videos, and I was like, gosh, this guy's really cute. And I thought to myself, but he's not conventionally attractive. But what was attractive about him is that he had a skill and a purpose and something that he was really passionate about. When I looked at the comments, sure enough, there were other women who also felt the same way. And it's about having that kind of, and he's like third generation lobster fisherman. So he belongs to something. He's not self-referential. He belongs to something that stretches backwards into the past and stretches forward into the future. And he has that thing that's missing for a lot of people. He's on a journey. And that's what attracts people to you also, is that you're on a journey that other people want to go on. I think that's what people are missing.
It's very interesting. Actually, would you mind if I just asked you a follow-up question on that? Because in your understanding of Tate, do you take him to represent therapeutic culture or to represent a critique of therapeutic culture? Because I've listened to quite a lot of his videos, because I'm thinking of going into mixed martial arts, and he might help me with that. But listening to them, the things he talks about are discipline, duty, and above all else, the message is again and again, work. If you work, you will be less anxious, you'll be less ruminating. He's internalized a lot of the critique of therapeutic culture. Activity is going to make your life better, and you're going to be less introspective by achieving stuff. So do you see him as part of therapy culture or as an alternative? Because if he's an alternative, there might be something positive in what he's saying.
Yeah, I think he's reacting to therapy culture, but it winds up being a kind of masculinized version of the exact same thing, because it's ultimately self-referential, and it matches an earlier form of therapy culture in like the self-help, self-esteem movement, for instance, which I think therapy culture has gone on a different trajectory toward the present, which is very victimhood oriented. Self-esteem movement wasn't great either, but it's just got worse since then. Brilliant,
thank you, Matilda.
Okay, I'll just pick up on a couple of those. So first of all, I just wanted to say something about the virile masculinity idea. And I think, yes, it's really important to have that conversation, obviously, but I think there needs to be a conversation that happens alongside it, which is about respecting female boundaries and understanding that if masculinity is directed outwards and linked to sexuality, there has to be recognition that women are able to say no, and that they are listened to, and that there is no issue or pushback once that happens, because I think that's all wrapped into the whole Andrew Tate thing. And then just quickly, I think you make a really interesting point, Ashley, about locating this kind of purpose, or sorry, being self-referential and no longer having the purpose in life being outside the body, and instead it becomes inside the body. And I think this links into how appealing the Tate message is, because everything is so complex. It's really hard to find a purpose in life and to find that meaning, particularly when you've got so much information out there on the internet. You can explore any kind of avenue that you like. And if you've got somebody who actually locates that direction within you, so it becomes within your power, and you've got some very, very easy steps to follow, that is, I think, part of why this has taken off to such an extent.
Okay, thank you very much. Dennis?
I just really agree with what Ashley was saying about the sort of barrenness, as it were, of young male lives at the moment. She brought up the example of the fisherman, and that being an attractive sort of role model. It's hard to overstate just how barren online rabbit holes are. We see this a lot in gender, right? We see people who get lost on the internet, lost in a tribe, read all sorts of rubbish on Reddit, normally people on the autistic spectrum, and then 2 weeks later they've got a trans identity or they're non-binary or something like that. It's important to notice just how barren life is, because in a fairly comfortable life in front of your computer screen, smartphone, age 12, iPad, when you don't have that sort of world, not only do you not have the sort of manual skills that Ashley was talking about that young men tend to crave and really enjoy, you've got a wider collapse in as I described at the counter-enlightenment. You've got a left wing that is now purely identity focused. There's no 16-year-old communists these days like there were when I was growing up. You've got a right wing that is pretty much just consumerist rather than patrician or grand narratives these days. So you don't have quite the same unbearable young Tory types. Young kids don't seem to be in rock bands and stuff as much as they used to. There's this internal ruminatory experience which tracks with depression and tracks with these barren, empty lives. And as much as Tate has the odd positive message here and there, go out and do your duty, you don't see that. You see people just chaining his videos. And all I see are commentaries on his videos of Tate knocks it out the park with this, or Tate dismantles this. So there's videos on videos on videos and videos. Begins to look like a hall of mirrors. And when I see that, and I see the young men making these videos, it reminds me that if there's one biological sex that's prone to hero worship and hierarchies, it's males. And Tate exploits that very, very, very effectively. And I notice this all the time in the gay rights movement. It's certainly hierarchy-wise. If a hero like Fred Sargent says something, that's more or less law. His word is law, and he deserves to be respected. But we do seem to be hierarchical, and we do seem to have hero worship for a figure like that as, in that example, a hero of our movement. And I think that's the gap Tate is filling.
Okay, thanks. Nick?
Well, there's loads to reply to. I mean, I'll just pick up on this idea from the audience member about there being no core to what Tate promotes. And Ashley's also said it's a self-referential project and there's no project beyond the self. Well, to be very fair to Tate, he has now converted to Islam. So he's obviously realized, and you see, well, people are laughing, but you can laugh at it, but he's obviously realized there has to be some larger meaning himself. And, whether you find it cynical, whether you believe it, he has stopped drinking, he's doing all the things. So he also, tries to promote family. He was in prison in Romania. He was worried about still providing for his family while in prison. And he also has attempted to form a community. He's got the war room, and you can laugh at these things, but they're an attempt to have a community. And they're only going to get weirder, by the way, as well. I was interviewing Jack Donovan the other day, and he's invented a whole thing called solar idealism, which seems to be largely men going out to the desert and doing weird rituals together. But this is what's going to happen. Men are going to come up with stuff like this. So. And it's very anti-therapy culture, actually, because he had a therapist interview him twice, and he kept saying, he's totally against therapy. But I understand the point. It's emerged from the self-help world, which itself was a replacement of evangelical Christianity in America, probably, filling a void there. Just on the humor point, Tate is very funny, and that's what, if you've got half a brain, you can see. And you can also see when he's serious and when he's funny. And we have to trust young men to be smart enough to do that. And also, one aspect we've missed is the class aspect. It is funny to see. I come from a state school from the north, so Tate just talks like we all take, slightly more urban version, but it's basically how we come from the country. But we all talk like that. It's not surprising to men. That's how men talk. And by the way, women aren't ready for how actually bad men are in WhatsApp groups. I've tried to tell them, but it's so much worse than they're ready to even hear. It's like, if as bad as you think it is, it's 100 times worse, but we are just joking. So that's the thing, and we get that. And actually, Tom Segura, the comedian, used to mock Tate on his podcast, and then he had him on the podcast, and Tate was brilliant and funnier than all the comedians. So that's the humor part. And one other quick thing is just, and the class aspect as well. And Tate's dad is a black American, which people don't think about. He's had a tough upbringing. It's like if you were a rapper, everyone would go, yeah, he sold drugs, but now he's a businessman, like Jay-Z or 50 Cent. Well, Tate's that, really. He's come from a tough background in Indiana, then in Luton, black American dad with no money, and now he's had to do some dodgy things in the past, and now he's doing better. So that's actually a typical story. Very briefly on Dennis's thing about having a BMX and a few other points like that, and the burden of identity. The thing is there, it just proves my point about the feminized culture, because when you were younger, we didn't have that to the same extent, so there was a certain assumption, you just get out on your BMX. But now, because the culture has no positive there's no positive sort of water of masculinity to swim in, so it is on men to individually find it on their own. All right.
Excellent, thank you. Right, okay, so I think given the time that we've got, we might have said enough on Tate, and we might need to start looking at the second part of the question, which is, are young men lost?
Yes, as a straight male with a poor gaydar, I have a question for you, Dennis. How serious are you that Andrew Tate might be gay? I'll just add, the reason why I'm asking is I spent the last 3 years trying to talk my 14-year-old son, now 17-year-old son, out of listening to Andrew Tate. And I constantly joke every time he says, but Dad, Andrew says X, I say, you mean your boyfriend? Unbeknown to me, maybe I wasn't joking, so I'd love to be able to go back tonight and say, according to Dennis, he really is gay.
Okay.
So, I'm a young girl, obviously, and I actually support Andrew Tate and a lot of what he says. I disagree, I'm not sure what your name is, but I disagree with the fact that he has said some questionable things about women, but I think when he's actually speaking of more reason, he clearly says, be loyal to a woman, respect them, encouraging that family view, where I think at the moment in Western societies, there's a massive push on divorce, step-parents, step-children, all of this, all of that. Whereas I think he perceives a totally different image to that. And as well, how else do you teach boys self-discipline and how to take responsibility? Because people my age don't do that. They don't take responsibility, and they don't actually know what it means to be a man in that sense, where you don't run away from what you've done wrong. You actually admit, yes, this is what I've done wrong, but this is what I would do better. And I think that's what Andrew Tate massively says, if you've done wrong, become better, work on yourself, do this, do that. But how do you do that in an environment where kids are increasingly told, it's all about you, it's all about what you want, it's okay if you're not okay, don't be upset or be upset, and all of this. How do you make men, stronger?
I would say, first of all, that the notion that Andrew Tate is traditional, I think is complete nonsense. He's a guy who got rich through the most degenerate business possible, selling women's bodies. He's all about the individual. He believes in men sleeping around. He has multiple wives. He fucks multiple people. The notion that he's the beacon of traditionalism, I think is complete nonsense. And also, I think the reason that Andrew Tate is so destructive, as a young man, and I've watched lots of films, and people can be like, you're just a woke soy boy, or whatever. Is the main issue, I think, is he makes kindness and love and compassion with not being masculine. That's the pinnacle. And that's why people like Jordan Peterson and Rogan are so great, because they say, take responsibility, be a gentleman, and that's what it's about. It's not about, you can be a strong man, work out in the gym and all that, but you can also be a kind and love people. And he's all about the individual, and yeah.
Young man, very good. Can I come back to the person who just spoke? Can I ask you, young man?
Yeah.
Are young men lost?
Yeah, I'd say completely.
And why? Just explain that a little bit.
Yeah. I would say because there's pressure. It's a polarized debate. It's either, again, woke soy boy or strong big alpha, look at me, I'm the best. There's no in between of positive masculine things like working out, responsibility, and like waiting for someone without being a woke soy boy. There's no in between. And I think people, as soon as they realize there is an in between, then they realize they don't need to just, suck off Andrew Tate constantly. They can actually be their own individual.
Yeah.
And
who do you think's to blame? Why are we here?
I would say education, massively, like the feminization of education, getting told what to do, and
Yeah.
Everyone should listen to Rory's podcast, by the way. That was Rory. Quick plug for Rory. What's it called, Rory? Radical English Gentleman.
Yeah.
Very smart.
Very good. Thank you, Rory. Okay, yeah.
I'd just like to say, I think we should be focusing less on what Andrew Tate says and what he actually does, because there are some things that Andrew says that, are of value and are potentially correct. But like you said, he gets his money. He does a lot of things that aren't, exactly moral. Like he gets his profit off addiction. He runs casinos. He runs a pyramid scheme with Hustle University. He flies people out to do porn. So I think we should also be focusing on what he actually does and who he is as a person, because he isn't really someone that we should be looking up to because of that. It's not because he says the fancy words that we should just worship him. Yeah. And also to the point of him, I know I understand that he's converted to Muslim, so astaghfirullah, Allah samih, and all of that. But he still has that money that he got from those things. And in Islam, if you get money from something that is haram, that money is dirty money, and you can't use it. So you can say he's Muslim and all that, and everything he's done in the past is in the past. But he still has that money, and really the only way that he can make that money halal, make that money clean, is by giving that away to charity. I don't see him doing that. He's probably putting that into another Bugatti.
Yeah.
And
but can I just ask you, as a young man, are young men lost? Because we're trying to get, I accept all the points you're saying, but we're trying to get to that second bit as well, which is, Andrew Tate is one person. Why do we care? Why should we even be discussing him? The more important thing is whether young men are lost, because that's something we all have a responsibility to address that if it's a genuine problem. Suicide statistics have been mentioned. That's one end of it, but also a bit of an existential crisis. I'm not sure what I think about that. What do you think? Are young men lost?
Just before I go into that, can I just...
Well, would you mind going to that? Because I'm going to go to...
It's literally just one sentence.
Okay, go on then.
Okay. Just to answer the question from the lady over there, how do you teach boys all these morals and how to become a man? Well, that was actually my answer. The answer was a dad.
Okay, right, folks. Can we go through the chair just so... Okay, go on. Are young men lost?
Yeah, and I think it goes into a deeper issue with social media, because the way that the algorithm works is that it shows you more content based on what you actually listen, what actually you watch. So, so as a boy...
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there, but thank you. No, that's it. Okay.
Hi, I'm very aligned to Ashley's viewpoints about breakdown of community and family and lack of role models. And also the radical guy, who I recently subscribed to and I recommend. Very good. And the talk about the feminization of education. And I agree with both of those points, and I think we've discussed very much the problem, but what is the solution? So how do we bring back more great male role models? How do we into the community, not necessarily institutionalize it, but that's my question. What do we do about it now?
Okay, I'm going to bring the panel back at this point. just for comments, and I'll go out for a final round.
Rory was brilliant as always. We've been arguing about this for ages, and we were actually going to do a debate where it's going to be me and Carl Benjamin against Rory and Calvin Robinson, which would have been epic. We haven't managed to work it out yet. So we always disagree. There was a bit of a straw man from Rory there about people saying Tate was really traditional. I don't think anyone said that exactly, but plus he's pro-mass immigration, so a lot of questionable views. But the main thing about Tate, well, one thing I was thinking of when people were talking there, Tate is like I see him as like an imperfect general in the culture war a little bit. I mean, it's not that he gets everything right, it's just he's directionally right, you know, because it's at least pro-masculinity, and that's where we are, where just anything is better than nothing, you know. So I think of him like, I don't want to say Churchill, but, you know, no leader has been perfect. They're always incredibly flawed characters, so that's kind of the way I see it. And yeah, it was a great point from the young lady over there. We do need fathers. Obviously, Jordan Peterson has been called a sort of internet dad, or whatever he is, and that is where the root of the problem is in many cases.
Nick, can I just ask you, are young men lost?
I'd say yes, yeah. But then I don't want to condemn them with that phrase, because, you know, what did you say they were lost, Rory, or not? Yeah. You said they were. So you say, I'd prefer to ask a young man, but I would say they are, and hence all this. But I don't mean it in a sort of negative way, because I think they are trying and they are looking around and they're rejecting the ridiculous woke cultures. Many of them are, not all of them. So there is also that, you know, they're coming back.
Okay.
I'd just say this. When you get a cultural dysfunction in the expression of masculinity, things get vulgar, provocative, and silly really quickly. I'll give you the example from the gay world. You can chart in aesthetics, in homosexual male culture, you can spot the missing AIDS generation, all right? So homosexuals, again, to quote Camille Paglia, homosexual men in particular, civilization's custodians of male aesthetics, she says. We are the people who are allowed to celebrate the male form, to celebrate what men look like and dressing up and that sort of thing. I can see the break in the chain of cultural custodianship, and particularly in the descent into drag. Drag is one of the most dominant cultural forms of the expression of gay men presently on television. RuPaul's Drag Race is absolutely everywhere. Drag is a go-to reference point for that. That's actually regress. It's a step backwards, because it is reducing gay men to the 1970s comedy clowns that we once were. It's a profound camp step backwards. And as I say, it comes from an impoverishment, what I call the break in the chain of that cultural development. Now, I see the same with virility. And I very much recommend the lecture, or the discussion, YouTube discussion between Paglia and Christina Hoffman on this subject, where they are bitterly angry that, say, I think 9 students in Berkeley or somewhere like that, male students, who had a WhatsApp exchange ranking the girls in their class about who was most attractive. It's the sort of thing that straight men just do, right? They all ended up suspended. So when I talk about virile masculinity and microaggressions and trigger warnings having absolutely no counterpart in the homosexual male world, that's what I'm talking about. I, of course, agree that that's got to go hand in hand, of course, with respecting sexual boundaries. But we're in a very bad place if there's zero representation of a virile masculinity or moral masculinity. And that's why you get Tate and Peterson.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Matilda.
Okay, thank you. So the woman over there who mentioned the loyalty and respect angle, I think there is another counterpoint to that, which is about statements that women become owned by their husbands once they marry, and that rape victims bear some responsibility for that. So I think there's a lot of the dialogue which counters against this kind of feminist idea of what Tate was saying. And then to move on to the question that we're actually looking at now in terms of kind of are boys lost and what can be done. Somebody mentioned the area of self-discipline and said, is there an issue, or suggested that there is an issue that boys do not have sufficient self-discipline? And actually, I don't think this is an issue to do with sex. I think that there is something that has shifted over the last 20 years or so in terms of the amount of freedom that children get. And there was a research paper that came out very recently which has just kind of drawn together a whole load of different articles that have come out over the years, research papers, meta-analyses, which are starting to show that the lack of freedom that children have to roam, to play independently, to go away from the house is actually affecting their ability then to have a sense of self-reliance when they get a little bit older, and it affects mental health as well. So I think that's a big part of the puzzle. And then the point about education, I'm not sure I recognise the statement about feminisation of education, but what I would say is that there is a real lack of male teachers and therefore of male role models, and I think that that's something that is a kind of substantial block to boys where they stand right now.
Okay, thank you. Ashley?
Yeah, actually, just on that last point, I remember I did some TV show once where it was all about, like, what's wrong with men today? and people were, the women in the audience were on the one hand complaining about men as predators, and on the other hand, questioning why they don't have any male teachers. Right? Like, why would you become a male teacher when there's such an idea of men as predators? So, you are a bit weird if you go into that profession, is what it seems like, and I think that's part of the issue. So, on the question of lost boys, I do think lots of boys are lost, and in my family, I come from a very working class family, the ones who did best were the ones who got married relatively early, at least in terms of, when people get married now. And they started making families. They became a head of a household, and they had that project that was meaningful to them and something to dedicate themselves to. Whereas my brother was a lost boy as well. He's older now. He was completely lost, getting arrested all the time. It was a really awful time for my family, but my dad refused to give up on him, just absolutely would not give up on him. Did everything that he could to get him a trade. Again, a purpose and a meaning in his life. Now, my nephew is a lost boy, and he loves Andrew Tate. And he's completely cut off from real men in his life. He is completely set adrift. But the interesting thing about him is that there's nothing beyond the screen. He loves Andrew Tate, but it's an entirely vicarious experience for him. And people have asked in the audience, they said, well, how else do you teach men to be a man? By trying it out in the real world. And that's what those intergenerational relationships were about. It's not a vicarious experience, it's a real experience in the world. You will do something stupid and be mocked ruthlessly for it by your teammates when you are like out at a club after a game or something like that. But the thing is, why would my nephew try it out in the real world now? There's not a toleration for young men making mistakes, right? If you clumsily hit on a woman, that's really scary and can have at least I don't know if it's true, but that's the sort of cultural message you get. You're a creep, you're horrible, all these sorts of things. We have very little toleration for young people making mistakes. And they're constantly told, like, oh, be careful what you do online. It's going to come back to haunt you. And like so much of their life is online now. Again, it's this message again and again, you can't make a mistake. So of course he lives his life on a screen, tucked up in his room, watching Andrew Tate live his life for him.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so... So I think we're getting to the final question, edging towards that, which is there seems to be a consensus that young men are lost. There's kind of different interpretations of that, and maybe the extent of that would be disputed amongst the panel. But what's the way forward? People have mentioned, is there a father's issue? As a teacher, if you look at the stats on male primary school teachers, it's dreadful. I mean, the extent to which men have withdrawn from that area of work, and that's got to be a problem, I think. So, is there an issue of male role models, fathers? Is it, in fact, a community issue? Is there an absence of places where older men and younger men can have a shared project that they work on together? Actually, you talked about the need for a higher purpose. And that's been the theme of the conference, hasn't it? The kind of looking for a higher purpose beyond the self. But what is that higher purpose? I'm not sure what that is. But we seem to be yearning for one. So, what's the way forward? Chap at the back has had his hand up for a while.
As a non-predatory male teacher, just to clarify that, I've been having this conversation with the boys in my class when Tate did come out, and you had half who said, "Oh no, we can see him for what he is. He's an idiot." The other half go, "Actually, he's saying a lot that we resonate with." And my question was always, "Okay, but would you want him dating your mum?" And almost unanimously they said no. So I said off the back of that, I said I'd like to do International Men's Day's coming up. I'd like to do an assembly for the school for International Men's Day. It doesn't happen. Where there's an opportunity for intergenerational mentoring or sort of like knowledge transfer. What would you guys suggest for me to say to the boys in the school as I'm going across all the years? What messages? What would you say to them?
That's a good question. Can I ask you, as a non-predatory male teacher, it seems to be that there's a degree of consensus that there needs to be moral education of young men, right? And that's an adult responsibility. Now, whether that's the teachers that do that, the community that does that, or parents, there'll be a bit of an argument. But as a teacher responsible for males who are growing up in a difficult world, complicated world, how do you think we ought to approach it? Because as a male teacher, I've reacted to some of the training that's been given, which is around toxic masculinity, treating men as if they're potential terrorists for being, I mean, it's just off the scale, this incel stuff that's being discussed as if they were Hamas or something like that. And there's just complete loss of perspective on what is a problem, right? I mean, adults have to, so how as a teacher, as a male who has male students, how do you think this issue should be approached?
I think the male teachers within the school have a responsibility with it, and I think which is why I wanted to do this sort of like International Men's Day thing. And talking to a lot of the other male teachers, they echoed what you said with regards to, I'm so glad somebody's standing up and saying this, because we, rightly we do lots of stuff to get girls into STEM classes and stuff like that. Actually, where there's, where there are potential, it's potentially lacking. But there's nothing, and I think we do have to be seen as role models. I do think we have to stand up and say, actually, this is what positive masculinity looks like. This is and just model it and say, actually, talking to the boys and rather than just preaching to them. I think that's the point.
Lovely. Okay, I'll try and get as many people in as possible. Yeah, there's a chap there with a green armband. Hands up. Yeah. Okay.
Are men lost? I think, yes, some men are. And the reason might be a sort of tactical error on the part of the noble cause of trying to raise the self-esteem of women by making it so that there are no desirable characteristics that can be described as essentially masculine. Strength, well, women are just as strong. Leadership, well, women are better leaders. Providing, well, why is it a man's role? And, things like being greedy and exploitative and violent have been called masculine and then toxic. Now, I hesitate to request a positive vision for masculinity because...
Okay, quickly, though, if you can, yeah. Thanks.
Right. I don't want a positive vision of masculinity because it feels weird. It feels like positive Islam. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
But the solution is stop trying to become oneself. You dedicate yourself to something other than becoming yourself.
Okay.
Then you become a man.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. I can see someone wants to respond to that. Yep. Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, go ahead.
So as a lesbian who's never been the slightest bit interested in femininity or masculinity, I've been listening to this discussion and thinking, as I often do, God, it sounds difficult to be heterosexual. I also want to say that, do you know that there's a controversial distinction of countries, that some countries are supposedly feminine and others are masculine, based on masculine is wanting to be the best, and the feminine countries are supposedly where you enjoy what you do. And by that token, say the United States, Japan, very heavily masculine countries, but the UK as well, a masculine country. I live in the Netherlands, which is a supposedly feminine country, along with Scandinavian countries. My kids had plenty of male teachers at their schools, and the young men I know, I wouldn't describe them as lost.
Okay, thank you.
My question for the panel is, over the years, the idea of a man has been slowly just withered away. It's been destroyed. So what would be the solution to build that image of what a man is back? Because we're seeing a lot of it from like a more feminine perspective, trying to build what a man is, but clearly it's not working because we're seeing things like Andrew Tate, the one filling that void.
All right, I'm 18 and I just left college this year, for a bit of perspective. I think young boys are lost, but we're not mentioning the fact that the map and the compass has been fucking thrown away. We've basically been pushed in the opposite direction of healthy masculinity by the woke movement, and they've sort of feminized men more and more and taught us to go against our natural evolutionary instincts. I had a conversation the other day with someone about Joe Rogan, and they described him as a misogynist, and I asked them why. Why is he a misogynist? And it boiled down to, in the end, him having big muscles and being confident. So, in retaliation to this, the pendulum has swung back too far, and now you're seeing people that maybe don't really agree with Andrew Tate at all, supporting him just because they want to move against this feminization of men.
Okay, very quickly, because I'm going to bring people back. Thank you.
It also doesn't help that social media promotes ideas that sound good but don't actually work. It promotes quick fixes and instant gratification. So we need to get back to ideas that don't necessarily sound good, but that work.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Dennis.
I just want to address the gentleman who had the school assembly issue, because I think I would say this, doing the best I can. I'd say to the boys, one, you're probably in the hardest generation of boys to grow up there has ever been, with everything you have to deal with and all the identity stresses. Two, don't feel obliged to have all the answers. Three, more screen time will give you more problems. Four, porn will rot your brain. Cut it out of your life if you possibly can. And five, working out if you were a good man or not is a question that will last you a lifetime, boy. Don't feel you need to answer it right here, right now.
Thank you very much. Okay, Matilda.
So I think the first point, and I talked about this at the beginning, I think a lot of people have suggested that we need to kind of rebuild a positive view of masculinity. And I think while doing that, we have to be really, really careful about not stereotyping, not going back to really, really rigid ideas rather than an entire idea of a person. And I think that's what's got us into this whole kind of situation where you've got huge numbers of teenagers identifying out of their sex because they don't feel comfortable with those stereotypes. And I think we've got to be really, really careful not to make that worse. Then secondly, I think the purpose point is really important, and that doesn't just go for boys, that goes for girls too, trying to find this kind of purpose and meaning outside of the self and the selfies that go alongside that. Somebody asked about messages for boys. I think one of the really important ones is that porn is not real, that is not a real reflection of a healthy relationship. And linked to that, the relationship between girls and boys is not about subjects and objects, it's actually about human relationships, and it's teaching people to relate as people, not as a kind of idea on a screen. And then finally, in terms of kind of what we can do, I actually think one of the most interesting ideas, it was preceded, there were a few people that had suggested it prior to Richard Reeves, but it comes out again of his book, Of Boys and Men, which is an idea that you hold right from the beginning of school, you hold boys back by a year, and then you get to the point of kind of education when they're 13, 14, girls are outstripping them, they're feeling as though they have been left behind and they're lost. They don't have that because their kind of education matches their development, and so does their cohort.
Okay, thank you. Ashley.
Someone asked how to build back what it means to be a man. Stop thinking so damn much about yourself. You don't need to think about yourself that much. In fact, that was what men had historically, that they had the freedom to not have to think about themselves so much, about their bodies, about, the ideal of a man, which feminists had always railed against, this false dichotomy was that men were suitable for public life because they were closer to God, you know, they were further from nature. They were able to be other-oriented. They could live in the public world. And women were closer to the body. They were closer to nature, and they were more ruled by their emotions, and supposedly that was why they weren't suitable for public life. And feminists were like, no, there's no necessary reason for that. And now what we're facing is like we've drawn this dichotomy again and said, actually, ladies, that's great. It's good that you're focused on your body. It's great that you're close to your emotions. I'm like, excuse me? That's highly insulting. You know, that we can all be other-directed. We're all suitable for public life. None of us need to think about our damn bodies and selves and minds and brains that much. We can think about what we're creating in the world. And it's not for us to judge whether I am a good woman or I'm a good man. That's for the world to judge based on what we do.
Okay, thank you. Nick, the final word.
A lot of pressure. I started very strong today, and I think I petered out a bit. It can be an issue for men, I've heard. A lot of pressure. All right, well, the gentleman there made a very good point about what quality the men have uniquely. We're told now women can be just as strong, women are just as leaders, etc. The answer to that is actually the potential for fatherhood. Not necessarily literal fatherhood. Jesus didn't have any children, etc., but the potential for fatherhood. And what that means. And that can even mean being a kind of dad to the internet like Jordan Peterson, that impulse to guide and help men. That, I think, is the key. The other thing we haven't talked about, now, I'm very reluctant to say bring back patriarchy because I want to get out of the building alive. But patriarchy just means rule by fathers. So actually, what I think the answer is to bring back the father, both in the micro, in a family maybe, but in the macro, the symbol of the father in society. And I think feminism has caused a lot of problems in that way. I said earlier that Tate's a feminist, but also I've heard the idea recently that feminism is misogynist, which was an interesting one, because it says that women have to be like men and be the boss bitch and all this kind of thing. Actually, what we should be doing, I think, is celebrating difference, which is not the same as diversity, which is now a meaningless slogan, but actual difference, which means celebrating fathers and mothers and their roles. That's where I think the future is, hopefully. And you can get my affiliate link to Hustlers University. Just kidding. Thank you very much.
Okay, can we thank our panel?